The sun hung high in the clear blue sky as 12-year-old Amara ran across the basketball court at Riverside Park. Her sneakers squeaked against the pavement as she dribbled the ball with practiced ease. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon, the kind that feels like it might stretch on forever. "Over here!" shouted Dion, waving his arms. Amara faked left, then passed right, the ball sailing through the air into her friend's waiting hands. The small group of middle schoolers had been playing for hours, their laughter echoing across the park. Amara wiped sweat from her forehead and grinned. Being team captain of her school's basketball team came with a certain pride, and today she felt on top of her game. Her dad always told her that hard work paid off, and she was living proof of that. 3 hours of practice every day after school had made her the tallest and fastest player in her grade. Water break, called Kira, already heading toward the drinking fountain near the playground. The others followed, their energy seemingly endless despite the afternoon heat. "Did you see that last shot?" Amara asked, still riding high on their gameplay. Coach would have been proud of that one. Her friends nodded in agreement as they took turns at the fountain. Nearby, families spread picnic blankets on the grass, children climbed the jungle gym, and elderly couples strolled along the tree-lined paths. It was the kind of peaceful community scene that made Riverside feel like home. None of the kids noticed the middle-aged white man sitting alone on a bench about 20 feet away. Gregory Wilson had been watching them for the past 30 minutes, his face growing increasingly sour with each burst of laughter from the children. He clutched his newspaper so tightly that the pages crumpled between his fingers. "They're getting louder," he muttered to himself, glancing around as if seeking agreement from anyone. But the other adults in the park seemed unbothered by the children's joy. In fact, many smiled as they passed the basketball court. Gregory had moved to this neighborhood 8 months ago, and he'd been complaining to the homeowners association ever since. Too many changes happening too fast for his liking. When he was growing up, kids knew to be quiet in public places. Or at least, that's what he told himself was the real problem. Back at the fountain, Amara was telling her friends about last week's game against their school rivals. Her hands moved animatedly as she described the final moments. "We were down by 2 points, 10 seconds left on the clock," she said, eyes wide with excitement. Coach looked straight at me and said, "It's your moment, kid." Her friends leaned in, even though they'd heard this story 3 times already. There was something about the way Amara told it that made it feel fresh each time. So I took the ball down court, faked a pass to Tiana, and then, boom, she jumped up to demonstrate. 3-pointer at the buzzer. The group erupted in cheers and high fives, completely unaware of Gregory's growing irritation. He shifted in his seat, folding and unfolding his newspaper without reading a word. "Those kids need to learn some respect," he grumbled, loud enough for a nearby dog walker to give him a strange look before moving along. The basketball rolled away from the group, heading toward the bench area. Without thinking twice, Amara jogged after it, her mind still replaying her game-winning shot. As she bent to scoop up the ball, a gust of wind blew an empty chip bag across her path. She took 2 quick steps to avoid it and accidentally bumped into someone, a solid figure that hadn't been in her peripheral vision. "Sorry about that," she said automatically, looking up to find herself face to face with Gregory Wilson. His eyes narrowed as he steadied himself, something dark and unpleasant flashing across his features. For a split second, they just looked at each other. A 12-year-old girl with a basketball under her arm and a middle-aged man whose day was about to take a terrible turn. Neither one knew that this small, accidental collision would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. And neither one saw the police chief's car pulling into the parking lot on the other side of the park, right on schedule for his weekly visit with his daughter. The basketball rolled against Gregory's foot as Amara steadied herself after the bump. She reached down to pick it up, her sorry still hanging in the air between them. But something in Gregory's face made her pause. His eyes had narrowed, his mouth twisting into an unpleasant shape that sent a small chill down her spine. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice much louder than necessary for their distance. Amara took a step back, the ball now clutched against her chest like a shield. "I said I was sorry," she replied, keeping her voice level the way her father had taught her. "Stay calm, think before you speak, especially when someone else is getting worked up." Gregory stood up from the bench, his newspaper falling forgotten to the ground. "You kids think you own this place, don't you?" he said, gesturing broadly at the park. "Running around, making all that noise. Some of us come here for peace and quiet." Amara's friends had noticed the exchange and were now walking over, their faces showing confusion and concern. Dean stepped forward, stopping a few feet away from Amara's side. "We were just playing basketball," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "The courts are for everyone." Gregory's attention snapped to Dean, then back to Amara, then to the entire group of children who had gathered behind their friends. His face flushed a deep red, and something in his expression changed, a mask slipping to reveal something ugly underneath. "Everyone, huh?" Gregory laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Seems like the neighborhood's changing too fast these days. When I was growing up, people knew their place." An older couple walking nearby slowed their pace, the woman's hand tightening on her husband's arm as they overheard Gregory's words. A young mother pulling a wagon quickly redirected her route, moving her toddlers away from the growing tension. "What do you mean by that?" Amara asked, though a part of her already knew. She'd heard comments like this before, whispered in school hallways or muttered in grocery store aisles when people thought no one was listening. Gregory stepped closer, invading Amara's personal space. The children behind her shifted uncomfortably, but none of them left. They'd made a silent pact long ago to stick together when things got tough. "I mean that this park used to be nice before you people started taking over," Gregory hissed, dropping his voice but somehow making his words cut even deeper. "Go back to your own neighborhood." A hot flush crept up Amara's neck, but she held her ground. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." She squared her shoulders and looked Gregory directly in the eyes. "This is our neighborhood," she said firmly. "We live here, just like you do, and we have every right to play in this park." Something dangerous flashed in Gregory's eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a 12-year-old girl who refused to be intimidated. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't you talk back to me, girl," he growled. By now, other parkgoers had noticed the confrontation. A bearded man reading on a nearby bench closed his book and stood up. Two teenage boys paused their frisbee game, watching carefully. An older woman with silver hair pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the screen. "I'm not talking back," Amara said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling in her stomach. "I'm just saying we have the right to be here. We're not doing anything wrong." It happened so fast that later, when people described it, they all had slightly different versions. Gregory's hand shot out, connecting with Amara's face with enough force to knock her sideways. She stumbled, dropping the basketball as she tried to catch herself. Her sneaker caught on the pavement, and she fell hard onto her side, a small cry escaping her lips more from surprise than pain. For a moment, the entire park seemed to freeze in shock. Then everything happened at once. "Hey!" shouted the bearded man, already moving toward them. Kira rushed to Amara's side, helping her friend sit up. A thin line of blood appeared on Amara's cheekbone where Gregory's ring had caught her skin. "Someone call 911, called the silver-haired woman, her phone now pressed to her ear. Gregory stood motionless, staring at his own hand as if it had acted without his permission. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face as he registered the crowd gathering around him, the phone's recording, the shocked expressions turning to anger. "She got in my face," he said weakly, but no one was listening to him anymore. And no one noticed the black SUV that had just parked at the curb, or the tall man in a police chief's uniform who was stepping out, looking for his daughter. Chaos erupted in the park as if someone had flipped a switch. The peaceful Saturday afternoon shattered like glass, replaced by shouts and rapid movement. 3 men rushed forward, positioning themselves between Gregory and the children. The bearded man who had been reading reached Amara first, kneeling beside her as Kira held her friend's hand. "I'm a nurse," said a woman in a bright yellow sundress, pushing through the gathering crowd. She crouched next to Amara, gently tilting the girl's face to examine the cut on her cheek. "It's not deep, honey. Head wounds just bleed a lot." Amara nodded, surprisingly calm despite the thin trickle of blood and the throbbing pain spreading across her face. She'd fallen hard during basketball games before. The physical hurt she could handle. It was the other kind, the shock of being struck by an adult, the humiliation of falling in front of everyone, the ugly words still ringing in her ears, that threatened to overwhelm her. "You're being very brave," the nurse whispered, pressing a clean tissue to Amara's cheek. "Take deep breaths." Meanwhile, Gregory found himself surrounded by angry parkgoers. A stocky man in a baseball cap planted himself directly in front of him, arms crossed. "You're not going anywhere, buddy," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You just hit a child. A child." Gregory's bravado began to crack around the edges. He looked around wildly, suddenly aware of the phones pointed at him from every direction. His face appeared on a dozen screens, his actions captured in high definition. "She provoked me," he insisted, his voice rising. "You all saw it. She got in my face." "The only thing we saw was a grown man hitting a little girl," said a teenage boy, his disgust evident. "And now everyone's gonna see it too." He held up his phone, already typing something on social media. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the commotion. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, moving purposefully toward the crowd. "Over here," called several voices at once, pointing toward Gregory. The silver-haired woman who had called 911 stepped forward to meet the first officer. "That man," she said, pointing at Gregory, "struck that young girl over there. Unprovoked. We all witnessed it." The officer nodded, speaking quietly into the radio on his shoulder before approaching Gregory, who had begun to sweat visibly despite the cooling afternoon air. "Sir, I need you to stay right where you are," the officer said, one hand resting on his belt. "This is ridiculous," Gregory sputtered, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "It's been blown way out of proportion. I barely touched her." On the other side of the gathered crowd, Amara sat on a park bench, the nurse still beside her, applying pressure to her cheek. Dian and the other kids formed a protective semicircle around their friend. "Your dad's going to flip," Dian said, trying for lightness but missing by a mile. "Yeah," Amara agreed quietly. She hadn't cried, not yet, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "He's actually supposed to be here already. We always meet up on Saturdays after his community meeting." As if summoned by her words, a black SUV with government plates pulled up behind the police cruisers. The vehicle hadn't even fully stopped when the driver's door flew open. A tall man in a formal police uniform stepped out, scanning the park with sharp eyes. The crowd parted instinctively as he walked forward, his face a careful mask of professional calm that did little to hide the concern in his eyes. One of the officers turned, recognition dawning on his face. "Chief," he said with a nod, stepping aside. The whispers spread through the onlookers like wildfire. "That's the police chief. That's her dad. Oh man, this guy is in trouble now." Gregory, hearing the murmurs, turned to follow everyone's gaze. The color drained from his face as he watched the uniformed figure move purposefully through the crowd. The police chief didn't look in Gregory's direction, his focus entirely on finding his daughter. When he spotted Amara on the bench, something flashed across his face, a split-second break in his professional demeanor that revealed the father beneath the uniform. He quickened his pace, reaching the bench in long strides. "Amara," he said, his voice steady but tender as he knelt in front of her. "What happened?" All eyes shifted between the father and daughter and the man who now realized exactly who he had struck. The park fell quiet as Police Chief Johnson knelt in front of his daughter. His uniform, pressed and perfect for the community meeting he'd just left, stood in stark contrast to Amara's dusty clothes and the small bloodstain on her t-shirt collar. "Someone hit me, Dad," Amara said softly, her composure finally beginning to crack now that her father was here. Her bottom lip trembled slightly, but she bit it, determined not to cry in front of everyone. The chief's eyes moved to the cut on her cheek, then back to her eyes. His face remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his gaze. 20 years on the force had taught him to control his emotions, especially in public. But this wasn't just any case. This was his daughter. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" he asked, his voice level as he gently examined her arms and shoulders for additional injuries. Amara shook her head. "Just my face. And my hip from falling." The nurse in the yellow dress stepped forward. "I've been helping her, Chief. The cut is superficial, won't need stitches. but she'll have some bruising." Chief Johnson nodded his thanks, then stood, keeping one hand on Amara's shoulder. "Who did this?" he asked, his question directed at no one in particular, but demanding an answer all the same. A dozen hands pointed toward Gregory, who now stood flanked by 2 officers. The crowd parted, creating a clear line of sight between the police chief and the man who had struck his daughter. For the first time since his arrival, Chief Johnson looked directly at Gregory. Their eyes met across the space, and Gregory visibly flinched. "That's him, Dad," Amara confirmed quietly. "He got mad when I accidentally bumped into him. He said some really bad things before he hit me." The park fell so silent you could hear the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Everyone watched, waiting to see what the police chief would do. Some expected an explosion of paternal rage. Others wondered if he would abuse his position of power. Instead, Chief Johnson squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently, then walked toward Gregory with measured steps. His face revealed nothing as he stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back. Gregory looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his earlier indignation had evaporated completely. "Chief, he started, his voice cracking. "Officer Patel," Chief Johnson said, cutting him off without raising his voice. He turned to one of the officers beside Gregory. "Please read this man his rights and process him according to protocol." Officer Patel nodded, pulling out his handcuffs. "Yes, sir." "Wait," Gregory said, panic rising in his voice. "Can't we talk about this?" "I didn't know she was your daughter. It was just a misunderstanding." Chief Johnson's expression didn't change, but his words carried clearly across the hushed park. "That's irrelevant. Whether she's my daughter or anyone else's daughter makes no difference under the law. You struck a minor in front of multiple witnesses." He turned to face the gathered crowd. Did anyone hear what was said before the assault? Several people stepped forward, including the silver-haired woman who had called 911. "He was saying horrible things," she said, her voice shaking slightly with anger. "Racist things. Telling these children they didn't belong here. He said you people and told them to go back to their neighborhood," added the bearded man. Then when she stood up to him, he hit her. Chief Johnson nodded, his face a professional mask. "Officer Rivera, please take full statements from all witnesses." He turned back to Gregory. "You'll be charged with assault on a minor. The district attorney will determine if hate crime charges apply based on witness testimony." Gregory's face crumpled as the reality of his situation sank in. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My job, my reputation." "You should have thought about that before you hit a child," Chief Johnson replied evenly. "Officer Patel, please continue." As the officers led Gregory toward the waiting police car, Chief Johnson turned away, walking back to where Amara still sat on the bench. The crowd watched as his professional demeanor softened, the police chief becoming simply a father again as he sat beside his daughter. "I'm proud of you," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders, "for standing up for yourself and your friends." Amara leaned against him, finally allowing a few tears to fall now that the worst was over. "I was just doing what you taught me," she whispered. Gregory Wilson sat in the back of the police cruiser, watching through the window as paramedics arrived to properly examine Amara. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees, the metal handcuffs cold against his skin. Everything had happened so fast, the argument, striking the girl, the crowd surrounding him, and then the arrival of the police chief himself. Gregory's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the nightmare he created for himself. Just last week, he'd seen Chief Johnson on the evening news talking about new community policing initiatives. The man had seemed impressive even then, tall, authoritative, articulate. But seeing him in person, knowing he'd just struck the man's daughter, brought a new level of fear that Gregory had never experienced before. Officer Patel slid into the driver's seat of the cruiser, adjusting his rearview mirror to make eye contact with Gregory. "You really messed up today," the officer said, his voice matter-of-fact rather than angry. "Do you understand what's happening now?" Gregory swallowed hard. "I'm being arrested." "For assault on a minor," Officer Patel confirmed, "with potential hate crime enhancements based on witness statements about what you said before the assault." "I'm not racist," Gregory protested weakly, but even to his own ears, The defense sounded hollow after what he'd said at the park. Officer Patel just shook his head and started the engine. Across the park, Amara sat inside the ambulance with the doors open, a paramedic cleaning the cut on her cheek more thoroughly. Chief Johnson stood nearby, alternating between watching the procedure and speaking quietly into his phone. "It doesn't need stitches," the paramedic confirmed, applying a small butterfly bandage to the cut. "But you'll have a bruise for a while." "Any dizziness? Headache?" Amara shook her head. "I'm okay." Her voice was steady, but her hands still betrayed a slight tremor. The paramedic smiled gently. "You're being very brave. Some adults don't handle injuries this well." Amara's friends clustered near the ambulance, their earlier playfulness replaced by concerned faces. Kira stepped forward, handing Amara her water bottle and backpack. "We got your stuff," she said. "Are you really okay?" "Yeah," Amara replied, managing a small smile. "It looks worse than it feels." She paused, then added more quietly, "The things he said hurt more than getting hit." Chief Johnson finished his phone call and approached the ambulance, nodding his thanks to the paramedic. "You're all set to go home," he told Amara. "Mom's already there waiting for us." Amara's eyes widened. "You told her?" "Of course I told her," her father replied, his serious expression softening slightly. "I'd value my life too much to keep something like this from your mother." This drew a genuine laugh from Amara, easing some of the tension that had built up over the past hour. The chief turned to address her friends. "You all did the right thing today," he told them. "Sticking together, calling for help, and telling the truth about what happened. I'm proud of all of you." "What will happen to that man?" Dean asked, glancing toward the police cruiser where Gregory sat. Chief Johnson considered his answer carefully. "He'll face consequences for his actions through the proper legal channels, the same as anyone else who breaks the law." The children nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Chief Johnson helped Amara down from the ambulance, thanking the paramedics before turning to the remaining officers at the scene. "I'm taking my daughter home now," he said. "Officer Rivera is in charge of completing witness statements. I expect a full report on my desk first thing Monday morning." "Yes, sir," the officers responded in unison. As Chief Johnson and Amara walked toward his SUV, several parkgoers approached them, offering words of support and concern. "You've got a strong young lady there, Chief," said the silver-haired woman who had called 911. "I know," he replied with quiet pride. Amara climbed into the passenger seat of her father's vehicle, watching through the window as Officer Patel's cruiser pulled away with Gregory in the back. The man's face was visible for just a moment as the car passed, pale, stunned, a portrait of someone whose life had just changed irrevocably because of a single moment of hatred. "Dad," Amara asked as her father started the engine, "what made him so angry?" "I really did just bump into him by accident." Chief Johnson sighed, choosing his words carefully as he prepared to have a conversation no parent ever wants to have with their child. "Some people carry hate inside them," he began, "and it has nothing to do with you." 3 days after the incident at the park, Gregory Wilson sat alone in a small, windowless room at the county courthouse, waiting for his initial hearing. His normally neat appearance had deteriorated, his shirt was wrinkled, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he hadn't shaved since his arrest. The weight of what was happening pressed down on him like a physical force. His lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Ms. Chen, shuffled through papers across the table from him. She was professional, but not particularly warm, having heard his version of events with an expression that made it clear she'd represented many clients who had similarly poor excuses for their behavior. "The district attorney is pursuing this aggressively," she said, not looking up from her notes. "Assault on a minor carries severe penalties by itself, but they're adding hate crime enhancements based on multiple witness statements." Gregory ran his hands through his unkempt hair. "But I wasn't thinking about her race," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I was just angry about the noise." Ms. Chen finally looked up, fixing him with a direct stare. 12 witnesses reported hearing you use racial language before striking the girl. Security footage from the park entrance shows the children playing normally, not excessively loud. And your social media history, which the prosecution now has access to, shows a pattern of concerning comments about changing neighborhoods. Gregory's face paled further, He hadn't considered that his private Facebook complaints could be used against him. "What about my job?" he asked weakly. "Your employer called while you were being processed," Ms. Chen replied, her tone softening slightly. "Riverdale Real Estate has terminated your employment, effective immediately." They cited their zero-tolerance policy for criminal behavior. Gregory stared down at his hands. In just 3 days, his entire life had fallen apart. His neighbors had already started a petition to evict him from his apartment complex. His sister hadn't answered his one permitted phone call. And now his career of 15 years was gone too. "The media coverage isn't helping," Ms. Chen continued, sliding a newspaper across the table. Gregory's face stared back at him from the front page, alongside a school photo of Amara, smiling, innocent, clearly a child. The headline read, "Local realtor faces charges after assaulting police chief's daughter." "It's everywhere," Gregory whispered. "I've become the monster in everyone's nightmare." Ms. Chen gathered her papers, her expression professional once more. "Mr. Wilson, my job is to provide you with the best legal representation possible. The prosecution has offered a plea deal, which I recommend you consider seriously. Without it, you're looking at significant jail time." "And with it?" Gregory asked. "Probation, community service, mandatory diversity training, and restitution," she replied. "But it also includes a restraining order keeping you away from the Johnson family and that park, plus you'll have to make a public apology." Gregory nodded slowly. The thought of facing Chief Johnson and his daughter again terrified him, but he knew it was the right thing to do. For the first time, he was beginning to understand the damage his words and actions had caused, not just to his own life, but to a child who had done nothing wrong. Across town at Riverside Middle School, Amara sat in her favorite spot in the library during lunch period. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to a purplish blue, drawing curious glances from classmates who hadn't heard about the incident. Those who had kept asking questions she didn't want to answer. Her father had offered to let her stay home for a few days, but Amara had insisted on going to school. "I didn't do anything wrong," she had told him. "Why should I hide?" Still, she appreciated the quiet of the library. Her best friend Kira sat beside her, sharing a bag of chips as they worked on homework. "Everyone's talking about it," Kira said quietly. "My mom says your dad is being called a hero for how he handled everything." Amara looked up from her math problems. "He's not happy about that. He told me last night that he was just doing his job the way he always does." "He could have really hurt that guy, you know," Kira pointed out. "Most dads would have." Amara shook her head. "That's not who my dad is. He always says that the law has to work the same for everybody, or it doesn't work at all." The librarian approached their table, holding a stack of newspapers. "Amara," she said gently, "I thought you should see this before someone else shows it to you." She placed one of the papers on the table. There was her school photo next to the face of the man who had hit her. Amara stared at it for a long moment, then pushed it away. "I don't need to see his face again," she said quietly. 3 months after the incident at Riverside Park, the area looked completely different. Colorful banners hung from lampposts, announcing the first annual Community Unity Festival. Booths lined the walking paths, offering everything from local food to information about neighborhood organizations. Children played on the basketball courts where Amara and her friends had been that fateful day, while parents chatted nearby, keeping watchful eyes on their kids. Amara stood near the main stage, nervously adjusting the note cards in her hands. The small scar on her cheek had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She wore a bright blue t-shirt with Community Unity printed across the front, matching the dozens of volunteers bustling around the park. "You ready?" her father asked, stopping beside her. Chief Johnson was in casual clothes today, jeans and the same blue t-shirt, though many people still addressed him as Chief as they passed by. Amara took a deep breath. "I think so. There are so many people here." Nearly the entire community had turned out for the festival, which had grown from Amara's simple idea into something much bigger. What had started as her school project on creating positive change had caught the attention of the police department's community outreach program, then the mayor's office, and finally local businesses eager to sponsor the event. "You don't have to do this," her father reminded her. "Someone else can read your speech." Amara shook her head. "No, I want to. I need to. Her father nodded, pride evident in his eyes. 5 minutes, he said, squeezing her shoulder gently before walking toward the side of the stage where her mother waited, camera ready. Amara flipped through her note cards one more time, though she'd practically memorized the speech. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Kira and Dion, manning the lemonade stand they'd set up to raise money for new basketball equipment for the park. They waved enthusiastically when they caught her looking. The mayor approached the microphone on stage, tapping it twice before speaking. Good afternoon, everyone. What an amazing turnout for our first Community Unity Festival. The crowd applauded, parents lifting younger children onto shoulders for a better view. Before we announce the winners of the art contest and enjoy the music performances, I'd like to introduce the young lady whose courage and vision inspired this entire event. Please welcome Amara Johnson. The applause grew louder as Amara climbed the steps to the stage. She stood behind the microphone, suddenly aware of hundreds of eyes watching her. For a moment, she froze, but then she spotted her parents' encouraging smiles and found her voice. 3 months ago, something bad happened to me right here in this park, she began, her voice clear despite her nerves. A man hit me because of the color of my skin. It was scary and confusing and made me angry. The crowd grew quiet, many people remembering the incident that had made headlines across the city. But something good happened too, Amara continued. Strangers stepped up to help me. People from all different backgrounds came together to make sure I was okay, and that justice was served. My dad always taught me that one person's hatred doesn't define a community, it's how everyone else responds that matters. She paused, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered in the park, families of all backgrounds, elderly couples, teenagers, young children, all together in the same space where hate had erupted just a few months before. So I decided to focus on the good people instead of the one bad person, and it turns out there are a lot more good people in our community. More applause rippled through the audience. Amara smiled, gaining confidence. Today is about building something positive from something negative. The new anti-bias training programs for city employees, the community dialogue series at the library, and now this festival, they're all happening because we chose to come together instead of fall apart. She took a deep breath before delivering her final thoughts. I recently learned that the man who hit me has asked to participate in the restorative justice program. He wants to make amends. I don't know if I'm ready to meet with him yet, but I'm proud that our community offers pathways to healing, not just punishment. Amara folded her note cards, looking directly at the audience. This park belongs to all of us, and today we've reclaimed it as a place of unity, not division. Thank you. As the crowd rose to their feet in applause, Amara's parents joined her on stage. Her father wrapped his arm around her shoulders and leaned down to whisper in her ear. You've built something beautiful here, Amara. Something that will last long after the bruises fade.